If you're just joining us, please use the chat box to the right of the screen and tell us who you are and where you're joining us from today. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camille Tyndall-Watson, and I am the Digital Services Section Head at the State Archives of North Carolina. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses on managing records while working remotely and is part of COSA's 2020 Electronic Records Day observance. Today's webinar is also part of COSA's Fall 2020 slate of State Electronic Records Initiative webinars. Next month's webinar will examine how states are capturing web content related to the pandemic and other events. And this webinar will focus on digital preservation self-assessments and how to make them work for you. The Spring 2021 series of webinars will begin in January, so stay tuned for what topics we'll be covering then. Before we begin, I would also like to call your attention to a couple of video resources that SERI has developed. Managing Digital Content is a video series that discusses the core activities associated with digital preservation, identification of the digital content you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing the content appropriately, protecting it from inadvertent or deliberate loss or alteration, managing it over time, and providing access to it. These videos are modular, self-paced, and always available. They're a great resource for people who are new to your organization or to the topic of digital preservation. At the moment, the Utah State Archives is hosting them, but they'll move over to COSA's YouTube channel shortly. FAQs on bit rot is on COSA's YouTube channel, and it's a short, non-technical overview of what bit rot is and how to reduce the risk that it will affect your records. It's suitable not only for State Archive staff, but for agency record creators as well. More videos will be coming soon. The pandemic has slowed us down a bit, but we're currently putting the finishing touches on the first of a year-long slate of digital preservation videos and hope to release the first videos in the series very soon. So now for the matter at hand, managing records in an era of telework. So I'd like to introduce Christian Skipper, today's speaker. I will allow Christian to tell you a little bit more about his background and what he'll be speaking about today. And with that, I will hand over presenting capabilities to Christian.
Hello, folks. This is Christian Skipper, and I would like to bid you a happy Electronic Records Day, Electronic Records Day 2020. As the slide indicates, I am currently the Regulations and Records Manager at the Maryland Department of Transportation. I did work for about 9 years, though, at the Maryland State Archives before that. So I'm lucky to say that I have experience both at this point as a person who runs a records management program at a records creating institution, as well as at the eventual home of all permanent records in the state of Maryland. So it's given me something of a unique perspective of seeing this topic from both sides. I also, for the last few years, truth be told, I can never remember when I started this, but for the last few years, I have been co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Advocacy and Outreach Committee. So my co-chair is Patsy Mitchell, but the two of us have been running that subcommittee for a few years, and it is quite a good time. So if you're interested in being a part of the wider records management and archival professional world, by all means, look into that. We'd be happy to have you on the subcommittee. I just had to make that plug, of course. I will say, in the spirit of my federal colleagues, who I've heard at quite a number of talks, what I'll be talking about today represents my opinion and perspective as a longtime professional in the field, but does not necessarily represent the perspective, opinions, or views of my employer. So just bear in mind this is my own personal take on this matter. So, as we are all at this point painfully aware, the year 2020 has been defined by the COVID-19 pandemic. Beginning in roughly March of this year, of course, different timetables for different folks in different states, many institutions, private, public, not for profit, and so on, have been forced into doing at least some portion of their work in a telework environment, working potentially off-site, generally not at their usual office complexes or that sort of thing. So luckily, there was at least at many institutions a degree of infrastructure that had already been set up. So myself, for example, I was already teleworking on a regular basis. It was about once a week, or rather, shucks, it's been so long. I suppose maybe it was once a month. But in any case, the point is that I was on an irregular telework schedule, as I would imagine a fair number of my colleagues were. Beginning in March of this last year, however, that situation became much more widespread. Agencies and institutions had to adapt and see what the work environment would look like with folks not on site at their usual environments, with the typical access to both technology as well as all of the security measures that a general office environment entails, things like check-in desks and the like. So this had a pretty significant impact on operations. As we moved into a telework environment, institutions around the country and around the world had a variety of options to choose from as far as connecting their employees with the work of their agency or institution, as well as, more germane to our purposes here today, records creation, as well as record storage. And I apologize if this talk is in some ways particularly speaks to records creators. It's certainly what I do. But even in archival institutions, we are still creating records. We're still doing things that involve records creation and maintenance. So I think this should apply to us all. So a few setups that became common from March onward, and these are not mutually exclusive, as we'll get into, are using a device provided by an employer, using a personal device, like, say, a laptop or a mobile phone, using a virtual private network to connect to an employer's internal servers or storage locations, and or connecting to cloud-based apps, things like Office 365 and so forth. These, just to dwell on this for a moment, are not mutually exclusive. The first two categories are often mutually exclusive, and the latter two categories can sometimes be mutually exclusive. But there's sort of an intersecting Venn diagram here, where there's a decent likelihood that somebody using a device provided by their employer will be making use of a VPN and or making use of cloud-based apps. Similarly, a personal device could be used to access a VPN or cloud-based apps, or just create and maintain records locally on the device, which opens up a host of challenges that we'll get into here presently. With regard to employer-provided devices, I am of the opinion that where possible, this is the safest option. This is something like where your employer will have provided you with, say, a tablet or a laptop, or even in many cases a mobile phone. Is pretty common nowadays. I personally have not been provided a mobile phone, but a lot of employees are by their agency, where that's important to their work in the field. One of the reasons why this is a particularly safe option is that these devices tend to be configured by your IT department. Now, maybe your institution has its own dedicated IT department. Maybe you're working for an institution that's part of a wider network. And let's say you're a state archives or so forth, or a university system, and your IT department is part of that wider system. That doesn't really affect things here. The point is that if you're issued a device by your agency or institution, it's probably got some degree of virus protection that your personal device may well not have. That said, one of the important things that you're going to want to be doing with these devices, even when they're provided by your employer, is regularly backing them up. Now, ideally, your employer has configured these to be regularly backed up to some sort of network that they're running anyway. But if they haven't, you want to have that conversation with your IT department so that you are not going to be held responsible for having lost critical information in the event of, say, a shutdown or your device goes haywire and stops working or what have you. I'm sure we've all experienced device problems in our time working with computers. It's worth noting here that this is not always workable at scale, depending upon the size and resources of your institution. If you have a really large IT department and set of resources, this kind of thing is much more common. If you're a smaller enterprise or sometimes strapped for resources, as frankly most agencies and institutions have been due to the pandemic, this may not be a workable option. So while it is the best, in my opinion, it's not always applicable to across the board. Personal devices are a much more problematic option from my perspective, particularly as these open up employee devices to searches in public records requests or lawsuits, things like Freedom of Information Act requests and so forth. If an employee has been creating records or, certainly in the case of archives, doing some level of storage of records on their personal device, publicly accessible records, they may well need to be disclosed as part of one of these requests. That, as you can imagine, is quite a sensitive subject because employees, whether they're employed by a government agency, a private sector agency, or a not-for-profit agency, are generally not going about their job with the expectation that their personal devices may be subpoenaed and made available to the public, whether that's a targeted search or what have you. To resolve that tension, I would recommend making your employees aware of the risks. Having employees, if they are going to be using a personal device, be it a laptop, a mobile phone, a tablet, or anything like that, that they sign some type of document, that you provide some sort of information to them to make them aware that their personal device may be disclosed at some point. Because you're going to be looking at potential legal ramifications, both from the records requester perspective of, I'm suing to have this information disclosed. But if you don't make this kind of information available to your employees, make them aware of the risks, you may well be facing legal action from your employees when their device is requested as part of one of these cases and they were not made aware of it. So that's just a quick plug. Be aware of that type of danger and make your managers or leadership aware of that type of danger if you're not in a leadership position at your institution. This is something that we probably mostly are aware of anyway, but I did want to place a plug for it here because this is all the more important during pandemic conditions. Whatever's going on with the device configuration that your agency and employees are using, encourage your employees not to store government records on their personal devices. This is, of course, a security risk because personal devices are more subject to things like viruses or hacking attempts than government devices, but also opens up quite a bit of legal liability for you as an institution and for your employee as an individual. That I'm sure varies dramatically based on the laws in your state or locality, but it's just generally good advice. Do not store government records on personal devices. As you can see here down at the bottom, and we're going to get into this here in a moment, what you want to do instead when using personal devices, or indeed employer-provided devices, is to make use of a VPN or some kind of cloud-based app to store these records as soon as possible. So first, virtual private networks. Now, I'm not sure how many of you folks out there in webinar land have already been used to using virtual private networks. I will say I had very little experience with VPNs before coming to work at the Department of Transportation. But in the course of setting up my original telework system, my IT department set up a VPN for me to access our servers remotely, so it was all extremely secure. VPNs effectively are a quick digital pipeline to get from your device that you're using remotely to the internal server-based storage of your agency or institution. So this impacts things like your access to like documents that you view through Windows Explorer and so forth, as well as applications that are generally only accessible when you're on-site at your institution. Basically, this makes it so your device believes that it's at the physical location of your employer rather than in your home office or wherever you might be temporarily working. I am of the opinion that VPNs are a particularly good way to handle off-site work because they dramatically reduce the likelihood of storing records locally on a device that might become either compromised by a virus, a hacking attempt, or even just maybe damaged. And I'm sure most of us have at least some awareness of an instance in which a government-issued device was stolen or that sort of thing, if heaven forbid you've kept it in like the back seat of a car or what have you, which, again, you shouldn't do. But it's important to be aware of the risks associated with storing records locally on personal devices, but that risk is also true on government-issued devices. So VPNs really get around that problem by making the agency's storage available effectively at all times. With that, you will virtually never have an instance in which you're storing records locally on your government or private issued devices. I'm not sure how much of an issue this is. I included it here in the notes because in just thinking about this topic, it seems like the kind of thing that could come up. I don't have any personal experience with encountering an example of this having come up. But be aware that if you're using a personal device, especially to connect through a VPN to your agency's servers, there may be an increased risk of hacking due to the greater potential for spyware or viruses to be implanted on your personal device. Again, generally your government-issued or agency-issued device will have virus protections that are agreed upon and vetted by your IT department. Your personal device may not. So hopefully your agency has put some safeguards into place. So if you're accessing their VPN from your personal device, you're not liable to, say, transfer a virus or have some kind of spyware make your employer's data insecure. But just bear in mind that may be an issue. So you'll want to talk to your IT department or your agency's leadership about what the risks are there. That's going to vary pretty dramatically from one employer to another. Now, cloud-based apps. Much like VPNs, these can be used on a personal device or an employer-issued device. So these are things like Google Suite, Office 365, basically applications provided generally by a third-party client, in this case, for example, things like Google or Microsoft, that your agency is making use of for some manner of records management or even potentially archival storage in the case of archives. So if you're using an employer-issued device, you're going to be accessing these through that, but it's still going to require some kind of internet connection. If you're using this through a personal device, these are generally more available to use on a personal device because they often use some kind of web interface. So, for example, email is a good example of this. Many employees of agencies will use their agency-issued Gmail account from a personal device. So that's just one example of a cloud-based app. So these, in much the same way as a VPN, kind of get around the issue of increased personal liability for records being created or maintained on a personal device, because these are instantly being stored in the cloud. They're instantly being backed up, as you know, any of these cloud-based apps have extensive backup protections, and they have probably a reduced risk of spyware and hacking issues if you're accessing them from a mobile device. So these scale a little better. Depending upon the institution, these often don't require quite the same level of IT investment because they're leveraging, often very large private sector technology firms. So oftentimes these work a little bit better for a smaller institution to be doing work remotely. They mitigate against the risk of locally stored records being lost or employee devices having to be transferred as part of a lawsuit or public records request, but also don't require this huge IT investment to set up things like virtual private networks and employer-issued devices. The biggest risk here, and I'm really putting on my archivist hat for this one, the biggest risk here, in my opinion, is the risk of losing records in these types of environments if a service contract is discontinued. And I'd imagine plenty of us have experience with this. You know, one day you're a customer of Google, and then the next day you're a customer of Microsoft, or fill in the blank with your preferred records management suite solution. So if you or your employer are using this type of software, be sure that it's somewhere in your contract or your how it's being managed and so forth, that you're going to be able to extract records created or maintained in this system at the time that the service contract is discontinued. I can't stress that enough. That has been a perennial problem in electronic records management for the better part of, 2 decades at this point. So most folks are pretty hip to this, but just in case your agency or institution is not, be aware that while this is a very attractive option, there are certain safeguards that you're going to need to build in. So just keep that in mind when you're working with cloud-based apps. That's pretty well the end of this kind of blisteringly paced introduction to some of the risks and suggestions associated with teleworking, records creation, and records management in the COVID-19 era. But I am eager and excited to take your questions on the matter. Also, just so you note there, up on the screen is my contact information. I'm working from home at this point full time, so while that is my office email and office phone number, those are both being directed to me at my home office, so I'll be able to respond quite quickly. Thank you very much, folks. And I will, let's see, can I turn this back over to Camille? Let's see. I haven't used one of these WebEx things before. Here we go.
All right. Thank you so much, Christian. That was so interesting. So feel free, if anybody has questions or points for discussion, to share it in the chat. While we're waiting for folks to put in their own questions, I guess I'll kick us off with a question. I'm curious about any challenges coming in moving staff away from using Google Drive or Google Docs while they're working from home.
All right. Just to clarify, Camille, this is a question for me, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
All right. I'm not sure. Can't say that I have any personal experiences with moving employees away from using those types of software while working from home. It seems, if anything, there would be an increased reliance on using those types of software while working from home, since they're very easy to use remotely. They don't tend to require on-site access. Could you clarify that question for me?
I think what I'm thinking of is kind of what happens when we're no longer all working from home, when, like, once people have hopefully people have transitioned back into working in an office setting. Are there any challenges to moving people from using Google Drive, Google Docs back to, say, using their standard servers, or getting things off of Google Docs and into standard servers? For example, at State Archives, not everybody has VPN access to our servers. Only select staff do, based on what laptops we were able to procure. So any challenges there?
Got it. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, and I'm happy you brought that up because I think that issue with only some portion of the staff having access to, say, employer-provided devices or VPNs is going to be pretty common across institutions and agencies. With regard to moving away from things like these cloud-based apps once folks are back in the office, my personal experience with it is that it's not too much of a technical hurdle. So there's a few layers to this, and hopefully I don't ramble on at length as I'm inclined to do. The first layer is the technical aspect of extracting data from these services. And generally, my personal experience with it has been very positive. If you're creating content in here, things like spreadsheets and Google Sheets, or email on an Outlook server, or that sort of thing. Records in SharePoint, that's a popular, I believe that's a Microsoft product. Generally, you're able to extract these at least on an item-by-item basis from the system and download them to local storage or your agency's server storage, network storage, I should say. So getting information out is not generally too much of a technical problem on a small scale. On a macro scale, I'm not entirely certain. Things like extracting all content created in a SharePoint directory once you're back at the office, that's something that I actually don't have any experience with. So, gosh, that's a great question and could stand to be addressed at some length, but unfortunately I can't personally speak to it. The second layer of this is the question of whether you, in fact, will move away from this software when you're back in an office environment. I'm of the opinion that the pandemic situation is probably going to encourage larger scale changes in how public, private, and not-for-profit sectors do business even once the pandemic is over. So it wouldn't surprise me if even once the pandemic is over, there's a much greater reliance on these cloud-based apps. If they worked for folks when they were off-site working during the pandemic, there's not really a reason that they wouldn't work for folks working back in the office. There could be a greater reliance on network storage and so forth when you're back in the office. But if the cloud-based app has been, a cheaper option or maybe a more efficient option, or your leadership finds it in some way more appealing or workable, the fact that there's a bunch of records in it may well encourage the agency or institution not to discontinue use once you're back on site. Again, that's going to vary dramatically from agency to agency, so take it with a grain of salt, but that's my own personal speculation on it. Finally, the third layer of my answer to this question is not so much on a technical level, but on a behavioral level. So once employees have gotten used to this kind of thing, there's been a very hard transition for a lot of staff members who weren't working off-site to working off-site over the past, what's it been now, 7 or 8 months. That transition is going to be just as hard in reverse. And we're probably a ways out from standard office hours becoming a thing again for lots of us. So I would say the biggest hurdle is going to be retraining your staff out of using those cloud-based apps once you're back in an office environment. And again, that may connect with the second layer of my answer to this question, which is that if you've trained your staff to use all of those apps, it may become less appealing to retrain them not to when they're back in the office. Whether you consider that a risk or a good thing is probably up to your kind of personal perspective on the best way to manage records.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That was really helpful. And that actually segues nicely into another question, which is what do you think the biggest records management challenge is related to teleworking? And what kind of ideas do you have as far as handling or mitigating those challenges?
The security and integrity of the records themselves, as well as being trusted digital repositories, is just my personal opinion on what the biggest challenge is. maintaining things like chain of custody on documents. As I stated before, not maintaining documents locally. I think there's always been a risk, right, of losing records, be it at a records creating institution or agency or at an archival institution, when records are being maintained without proper backups, without proper security. And so that challenge is only increased in a remote working environment because there is a much greater, there's a lower level of direct oversight. So things like, connection to maybe your boss or that sort of thing. So you might be out at a coffee shop, heaven forbid, or something like that, and get an important message and be messaging on your personal device or what have you. So there is an increased risk of using non-traditional methods to create and maintain records. But then on top of that, there's an increased risk of things like hacking, things like spyware, because there are just more links in the chain of getting from records creation to in the short term, really well-regulated and maintained storage, and then in the long term for permanent records to an archival institution. I guess that's in some ways kind of a banal answer. Like I suppose we all could probably feel pretty confident that the likelihood of records loss is higher when there is a more dispersed and less regulated work environment, but that's certainly my take on it. And sorry, was there a second half to that question, Camille?
I think you kind of covered it with your ideas for handling or mitigating the challenge. I think you kind of covered it, but if you'd like to elaborate, I think I'd like to hear.
Well, just if there's one main takeaway from this talk, it is try to avoid using personal devices where possible, and where it's not possible, be sure to be backing those up and maintaining a record that those records were backed up, and that there's no longer anything just confined to local storage on a device that could easily be compromised or lost.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. They ask, when using cloud-based storage and we return to the office and are using a dock, do you think that we should back up or simply rely on the IT system regular backups?
Just again, a point of clarification on that. When you say returning to the work environment and relying on your IT backups versus a different kind of backups, am I to understand that you're referring to discontinuing use of that cloud-based platform? Whether my personal preference would be discontinuing use of the cloud-based platform and making use exclusively of IT backups, or doing some kind of hybrid solution of storing records in both places? And sorry, I know you weren't asking that, Camille, but I'm hoping whoever asked it will hear that and clarify.
Sure. I'm going to make sure I'm watching chat like a hawk. Well, while we're waiting for clarification on that question, another question that I had that maybe we can hit really quickly and return to that question is if your agency has or has had prior to the pandemic or has created since all of this has happened, any kind of standardized policy for how and where documents would be moved or stored during work from home? For example, if it should go in the cloud and where, or on flash drives, or overwriting and duplication and modification date issues of moving files around, anything like that.
Yeah, so I've been in charge of our records management policy, and again, just speaking for myself, not speaking for my institution. We have done quite a bit of work with regard to creating kind of standards and practices for maintaining records, both while we were at the office as well as now remotely. Let's see. So generally there are things like, and if I could hold off here for a moment, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Let's see. Oh, okay. I think that resolved it. So we generally don't use things like flash-based storage just because of the risks associated with it. We broadly don't use portable media at all. Now we're very lucky to have a really, just genuinely excellent IT department. And so they have done a ton of work to set up really extensive and wide-ranging VPN connections. So while we do use some level of cloud-based apps, I know SharePoint has been instituted for some offices. Generally, employees who are working remotely in records creation, again, it's Department of Transportation, so a fair number of our workers are working remotely in things that create no records. They're laying down road and doing maintenance and so forth. But for folks who are doing records creation, there is, to the best of my knowledge, we have strongly discouraged creating any kind of records on individual devices, and instead have adopted the VPN approach as much as is workable. That's my personal preference, so that's what I've tended to recommend.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a look at chat. I don't think we've gotten any clarification on that previous question yet, but another question has come in. They ask, to be better prepared for the next event that would force people to work from home, what things might we take to IT to have a good setup? None of us in archives have VPN access, for example, so we could do nothing on our website from home.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why work from home simply doesn't work for all employees, especially for employees who might be doing some kind of physical work with regard to in-person archival material. Heaven knows that's quite a few of us. That said, where your agency is encouraging work from home and you're able to do your work remotely, if possible, I would take to your IT the idea of exploring a VPN access. It is something that can be done if there's the kind of will and resources to do it. So, I would certainly make the case that is the most reliable option. That said, the next option down from that, again, in my opinion, is the cloud-based apps. So having your office set up some kind of remotely accessible cloud-based app that's done through, a username and password system through a web-based API. So I think you can use SharePoint this way, but certainly quite a few of us handle our email this way, or Google Drive can generally be accessed from a personal device. It doesn't require a VPN, and it doesn't even really require an employer-issued device quite a bit of the time. All it requires is a username and password. So that's probably the most affordable option if a VPN is not available. But outside of that, I would say maybe working with your IT department to set up some kind of standards and practices for getting work. If heaven forbid you're using a device and locally storing things to the device because you don't have any access to your employer's on-site network storage, setting up some kind of procedures for getting all of the records that you've created to your network storage at a regular interval. So say once a week you stop by the office and drop off a portable hard drive with all of your content, or they set up some kind of I'm blanking on the name of it, but an FTP, like a file transfer system online, some kind of secure file transfer system. So you have a regular directory on the device that you're using where you store things, and that directory can be, say, zipped and sent to your employer for somebody on site or somebody in the IT department to maintain a local copy constantly. So then if there's some kind of technical breakdown or that sort of thing, you've only got the the time since the last interval at which it was backed up to account for on your personal device or your employer issued but locally stored device. And that was a mouthful, so just let me know if that explained it or could use some more clarification.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to go back and check chat. Okay, so it looks like we have a follow-up to our previous question. Christian, would it be helpful for me to read the question again and then read the clarification?
This is the none of us in archives have VPN access question, right?
No, this was...
Oh, the earlier one. Yeah, if you could read the original question and then the clarification, that would be swell.
So the original question was, when using cloud-based storage and we return to the office and are using a dock, do you think we should back up or simply rely on the IT system regular backups? And then the follow-up says, when using cloud-based storage and we return to the office using a dock, do you think we should back up our files or simply rely on the IT system for regular backup? When putting the PC back on the dock, should we back up our files on like a shared drive on the network? It would seem like a duplication of records, don't you think?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I can see what this is driving at now. And yeah, records duplication is, the kind of thing that keeps records managers up at night, right? So yes, I'm sympathetic to that. I'm torn here. This is a complex subject. I'm torn between the dangers and problems associated with two potentially competing versions of a single source record in two separate locations. And, what if one gets modified and the other doesn't? Which has the greater level of integrity? That is a concern. On the other hand, there is, the locks principle, right? Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So it's always a challenge gauging whether keeping multiple copies improves safety and security against whether it decreases the integrity and the chain of custody of what is the official record copy of something. Broadly, I prefer a single copy of something, particularly from the record's creator's perspective. I don't want there to be any dispute about what constitutes the official record. So if I can maintain a chain of custody through, say, moving a record from that cloud-based solution to the network storage and then removing it from the cloud-based solution because it's now been safely stored in network storage, that would be my personal preference. But that's a complicated subject that you're going to want to talk through with your IT department and colleagues at your agency or institution, because on top of the, which you personally prefer, there may be some kind of records management law concerns, like, is it in your records retention schedule that you can move these things from one service to another and delete it from the original service? That's a question that you're going to need to work out on an individual level. But my personal preference would be maintaining a single copy and documenting where it came from, as long as it is properly backed up on your network storage.
Okay, and it looks like there's a follow-up question wanting to know what your take is on working directly on OneDrive. And I'll add, just for my own curiosity, SharePoint similarly. Do you think that that's a safe bet?
So bad news, folks. I have not used OneDrive. Unfortunately, I don't have experience working directly on those services. My experience with things like SharePoint tend to be records created on a device, a network device working through a VPN or that sort of thing, and then stored on SharePoint. So working directly on it, unfortunately, I'm not sure that I can speak to that. Just off the top of my head, no, I probably shouldn't speculate without any personal experience with it. So I think I'll have to leave that one to suggesting that you follow up on it a bit with folks who have more experience with it than I do. Sorry about that.
All right, do we have any other questions from everybody on chat? I have a couple more from that we had beforehand, just things that the SERI committee had thought were interesting, but I wanted to make sure that everybody who is tuning in had a chance to have their questions answered. Anybody on chat have anything else? I think we've probably got enough time for one or two more.
Yeah, it's Electronic Records Day. We've got all day.
Let's see. Oh, here's one. And this is a question for everyone else as well, if people want to chime in on chat. Do you know of any agency or state archive guidance documents regarding managing teleworking records?
Gosh, I would almost swear that I saw something about this just a couple weeks ago, and I'm blanking on it right now, but I do believe there was some kind of guidance somewhere. I'm going to take a note down to follow up with you on this. Because I don't have it off the top of my head, but I seem to recall that some state somewhere published something on this. In the back of my mind, it might have been Pennsylvania, but that's really going kind of as a knee-jerk answer there.
Oh, it looks like we have a link that someone shared in chat. North Carolina did a blog post on that about protecting public records while you telework, and Josh Hager, one of our records analysts, was kind enough to share that blog post. We also have some links to some guidance from Pennsylvania, too, in fact. So there's at least some guidance from North Carolina and from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Yes, that is exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah, there was some kind of a presentation just the other day. One of the folks, one of the newest members of the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee is from North Carolina, and actually did a presentation on this just the other day, and it tied in with the Pennsylvania guidance as well. So yeah, I would strongly advocate for everybody to look into these resources that are in the chat. I'm not sure if we can send them out to folks after the presentation. I'm not sure how that works. I guess that's a question for Rebecca. But yeah, this Pennsylvania guidance is exactly what I was thinking of. Where as a profession, I suppose we sometimes move a little bit slowly, not in a bad way. It's the nature of our work, right? But this is some really kind of forward-looking documentation that we should all be aware of.
And also, there's another link from Barbara Teague regarding COSA's guidance, which was using Pennsylvania's document as a basis. It looks like we have another question in chat. How are you working to ensure the assignment of correct retention while working from home?
Oh yeah, records retention schedules and following correct records retention guidance is a big part of my job. We are we've circulated we have an internal records management policy that makes reference to state law. We have been in regular contact with our employees about that, just to make them aware of what their records responsibilities are. But part of the records management program at my agency was assigning, having the head of each of our divisions assign a records liaison for their specific division. So we've kind of dispersed it a bit. So it's not, it's not a, what would you call it? Like, there's not sort of a single source of failure on it. It's the kind of thing where, because it's dispersed, and each office has a records liaison, there's somebody closer to the records creation process that is monitoring this as well, and making that office's staff aware of their responsibilities. So we have it at kind of multiple levels to make individual users aware. But also, since our IT division is, in charge of things like backups and so forth, there is a comparatively low risk of records loss because we have instituted really large-scale use of VPN. I've been really proud of it, actually. Our agency, again, speaking purely to my experience, our agency has really kind of stuck the landing on a really what should have been a very difficult transition, but I think we've done a really great job with both making staff aware of their responsibilities and instituting controls at a higher level.
All right. Well, it looks like we've got time for one more question. If anybody would want to chime in on chat with one last question.
Oh, shucks. It just occurred to me, I meant to add to that, we have an internal website set up with every office's approved records retention schedule, so staff should be able to check the approved records retention for any given record series at any given time. So we've worked to publicize that as well. That was a neat little pet project of mine, and I'm really excited to have those retention schedules easily accessible to to staff members, since there's, gosh, as you can imagine, there's just so many of them, But sorry, anyway, go on.
No, that's a really helpful detail. I was just saying that we have time for probably one more question before we wrap up. If anybody would like to give us a question in chat. Again, I've got a couple more here if nobody else has any questions. All right. Well, I guess one last question, and you kind of talked about this a little bit with your website, but how are you doing are you doing any kind of training for records managers during the pandemic to help make sure they're aware of these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am indeed doing training with records managers. So I am the kind of setup that we have is that there's a like a fully appointed records manager above me, because in Maryland the official records manager for an agency needs to be somebody in the executive staff, and I am not. I'm a lowly records manager. Not really. I'm being a bit facetious, but we do have the officially appointed records manager. And then I work with her. She's my direct supervisor, but I do most of the day-to-day work with our staff, both internally at our sort of headquarters division, as well as out at each of our transportation business units. So these are things like the aviation administration or the transit administration and so forth. So luckily, I had a series of in-person training sessions with them in 2019. And there hasn't been any real staff turnover in terms of who the official records liaison is for each of the transportation business units, which is nice. So I had in-person training with them back then, as far as making use of the tools and resources that are available to them, and an awareness of the laws and regulations and so forth. But on top of that, throughout the pandemic, I have been in regular contact with them. Just to check in on how things are going at their business unit, what sort of resources they might need from me, any kind of, if they need me to provide things like guidance documents, or to even have things like virtual meetings with them or individual staff members of any given office at one of the business units, because, as we all know, it's sometimes hard to make the case to certain folks about what the rules and regulations are. So sometimes it helps to have somebody come in from headquarters to say, here's what we're doing. So anyway, yes, I have been in pretty constant contact, not obnoxiously so, but in pretty constant contact with the records liaison, so we can ensure that there is an awareness of the responsibilities across the board, and have the infrastructure in place to enforce those responsibilities. I can't stress enough, I've been really proud of the records liaisons at our business units, because they've also been proactively contacting me with questions, and even working on things like updating their records retention schedules while we're all stuck off-site, teleworking. So it's been really heartening to see just how dedicated they are to that responsibility, on top of the numerous other responsibilities that they have, on top of the fact that they're working remotely. It's been really cool to see.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we are nearing 3 o'clock, and I want to make sure that we stay on time and respect everybody's time and not go over. So with that, we'll wrap up.
Could I make just one more quick plug real quick?
Absolutely.
Just as sort of a concluding statement on that, I would say one of the most important things that you want to do either at a records creating agency or at an archives or historical society is sort of a cultural shift during the teleworking the teleworking era. Just making staff aware that their responsibilities for records creation and maintenance while at home or at a remote office or what have you are every bit the same as they are when they're on site. And that probably goes without saying, but I think it can't hurt to stress every once in a while, especially as we're all kind of dealing with the myriad other life issues that we have during the pandemic, just to be reminded that the work that we're doing, certainly for government agencies, but also otherwise, it is not ours. The records that we're creating and maintaining do not belong to us. Particularly for the government folks here, they belong to the public. So bearing in mind that wherever you're working, you have the same responsibilities to safeguard records and maintain their integrity as you do in the office. Whatever tools it takes to make that happen, that's a logistical concern, and I hope I've given some options there. But the most important thing is cultural. It's most important to just have people be aware of what their responsibilities are.
And I think that is a great point for us to wrap up on. Thank you so much, Christian. For everybody else, we're wrapping up now. So when you close out of this webinar, there's going to be a short evaluation form that's going to appear on your screen. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation. The SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee really does read the evaluations and uses them to help plan future offerings. And finally, before we lose you all, I'd like to encourage you all to keep abreast of what COSA is doing via its website, the Twitter feed, Facebook page, and YouTube channel. This, along with other recordings, are on that YouTube channel, so you can follow along there or revisit interesting topics. COSA is doing a lot of interesting things, and we hope that you'll be able to join us as we do them. And with that, I will just say thank you to everyone for joining us and spending your time with us, and have a good afternoon.